Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young Kim. In the second and final U.S. presidential debate, President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden clashed over North Korea. President Trump said the U.S. and North Korea are not in war, maintaining the view that the two countries have a good relationship. Former Vice President Biden criticized President Trump for touting his friendship with the North Korean leader, calling Kim Jong-un a thug. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo publicly responded for the first time to South Korean President Moon Jae-in's continued call for an end-of-war declaration of the Korean War, emphasizing the importance of the resumption of the denuclearization talks. We'll discuss these and more. Joining us today is Dean Cheng, Senior Research Fellow on Chinese Political and Security Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Cheng specializes in China's military and foreign policy, in particular its relationship with the rest of Asia and with the United States. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He's a Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Young.
Thank you for having us.
Let's start with the U.S. presidential debate. One of the heated moments at the debate was when the two presidential candidates talked about North Korea. Mr. Cheng, President Trump and former Vice President Biden presented a stark contrast in their views on North Korea and its leader Kim Jong-un, didn't they?
Yes, they did, although I think the focus was more on the difference in their perceptions of their relationships with Kim Jong-un. I don't think either came out as though they trust North Korea very much. And certainly there doesn't seem to be much daylight between them on the key issue of denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. The debate sort of gave us a glimpse of what kind of approach the next president will take towards North Korea. Mr. Snyder, if President Trump gets reelected, can we expect his emphasis on the personal relationship with Kim Jong-un will continue?
Yeah, I think it's likely that President Trump will continue to try to advertise a top-down approach. The challenge, of course, is that the North Koreans have distanced the personal relationship between Kim and Trump from the government-to-government relationship. And so I think that the Trump administration would try to resume engagement at an early stage, but I think that it's hard to predict whether that would be very successful.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Cheng, do you agree with this view?
Yes, I do. And I frankly am skeptical that whatever approach is taken is going to actually lead to denuclearization on the part of the Kim family for North Korea.
Mm-hmm. What about former Vice President Biden? If he gets elected as president, what can we expect from him, Mr. Cheng?
Well, Vice President Biden specifically mentioned the idea of once again approaching China to help pressure North Korea. And I think that that is unlikely to be successful. The United States and China fundamentally have very different views of both North Korea and the future of the Korean Peninsula. I also think that his calling Kim Jong-un a thug, while accurate, is also likely to limit the openness of Kim Jong-un to having conversations with Vice President Biden, should he become president.
Right. Mr. Snyder, would you like to add to this?
Well, I think that the vice president, also some of his advisors have been talking about a step-by-step process. And essentially, I think that what Vice President Biden also hinted at was what I would call conditional legitimization after he criticized President Trump for legitimizing Kim Jong-un. So it was interesting that Vice President Biden left space for personal engagement.
How will the outcome of the presidential debate affect the future U.S.-North Korea relations then? Mr. Cheng?
I think that Kim Jong-un has one huge advantage. He knows exactly what he wants, and he has most of the levers that he needs, which is to keep North Korea afloat. So insofar as the U.S. is an obstacle, U.S.-North Korean relations have a limit to how far they would go. I do think that if the U.S.-South Korean alliance is weakened, that ultimately serves North Korea's ends. And I would hope that no matter who is president, that does not occur.
And Mr. Snyder.
Well, from what we can see on the current trajectory, I think it's going to be exceedingly difficult for the U.S. and North Korea to get back to talks. But I think that the X factor, what we really don't understand, is whether or not the level of distress internally in North Korea could be a factor that actually brings about a need on the part of North Korea to turn outward in order to solve some of its problems.
And a day before the presidential debate, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo publicly responded for the first time to South Korean President Moon Jae-in's continued call for an end-of-war declaration of the Korean War. He said the U.S. hopes that it can get back to the table with North Korea and would ultimately lead to what the South Korean president was speaking to. Mr. Snyder, what's your take on this?
Well, the key words in Secretary Pompeo's statement were no change. And I think the Trump administration has always been open to the idea of end of war declaration since Singapore, but it's always been linked to progress in denuclearization. And so I think that it's interesting the Trump administration has been more forward-leaning than any other administration on consideration of an end-of-war declaration, but it's very clear that there is an expectation that the North Koreans will do something in order to earn that declaration.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Cheng, could you share your thought about the end-of-war declaration as well?
Well, two things. One, I think that President Moon's approach versus President Trump's approach is the difference is one of sequencing. Do you denuclearize in order to get to an end-of-war declaration, or do you think an end-of-war declaration will somehow help denuclearization? I think President Moon is of the latter assumption. That is, if we have an end-of-war declaration, that might facilitate denuclearization. The other thing I think that hasn't been widely discussed is what impact an end-of-war declaration might have on things like China's ability to then argue that, well, there's no longer a need for a US-ROK alliance, or what is the justification for access to certain bases in Japan, which at least originally were rooted in UN declarations in support of the conflict on the Korean Peninsula back in 1950.
President Moon said earlier in his speech at the UN General Assembly that the end-of-war declaration will open the door to complete denuclearization. Is the U.S. position fundamentally the same with this or different, Mr. Snyder?
It's not fundamentally different. As Dean suggested, there's a difference in emphasis. Basically, it's a difference between a denuclearization embedded peace process and a peace embedded denuclearization process. But the key here is that they have to be linked. Moon, because of his campaign promises and domestic political context, always emphasizes peace. Sometimes it looks to us like it's peace at any price, but denuclearization is going to have to be a part of that process as far as the U.S. is concerned.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Snyder, South Korea's Moon administration has been emphasizing the urgency of declaring a formal end to the war. Will South Korea have to adjust its stance?
Well, I think that this is really a difference in emphasis on the part of each of the leaders. I think that the South Korean government knows very well the U.S. position. And actually, they know what they need from a national security perspective. And even though President Moon tends to downplay the need for denuclearization, I think that there's a widespread recognition that it's essential to South Korean security.
Meanwhile, Chinese President Xi Jinping gave a speech at an event marking the anniversary of China's participation in the Korean War in October 1950, which Beijing refers to as the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid North Korea. The speech took place almost at the same time with the U.S. presidential debate. Xi said in his speech that the Chinese people are not afraid to face challenges or invaders. He was obviously taking an aim at the United States. Mr. Cheng, how did you take it?
I took that speech as actually part of a continuum. If you go back to 2019 and possibly even 2018, we see Xi Jinping actually referring to the Korean War spirit, the idea of resist American aggression, aid Korea. This is a call for national sacrifice. And so while some of this is aimed at the U.S. as a signal that China is not prepared to accede to the U.S. American pressure, it's also a warning to the Chinese people that there will be hard times ahead, remembering that China lost 1 million troops in the Korean War. Their negative reaction to BTS recently, even raising the subject. So I think that this was aimed at two audiences, one at the U.S., but also at the Chinese people at a time when the economy is going through a rough patch, when jobs are sometimes being lost. And overall, China is facing a lot of different pressures, not just from the United States, but around the world.
Since Mr. Cheng, you mentioned BTS. Earlier this month, the global K-pop sensation BTS faced uproar in China over comments about the Korean War. Why did this happen?
China engages in political warfare. One key part of political warfare is public opinion warfare. And that means countering anything that, from the Chinese perspective, challenges China's messaging and China's image, which is why it's fascinating that when BTS to the shared sacrifice of American and South Korean soldiers during the Korean War, the Chinese took offense because they said Chinese soldiers suffered as well. What they, of course, failed to mention was that Chinese soldiers suffered because they wanted to prevent South Korea from existing. They wanted to keep the Korean peninsula divided, a somewhat different framework. But from the Chinese perspective, the bigger point was no one should be able to criticize China freely.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un visited the cemetery of fallen Chinese soldiers from the Korean War and also sent floral baskets to China to pay tribute. Mr. Snyder, how do you perceive the North Korea-China relationship will move forward?
Well, I think this visit was a symbolic expression of the limits and context of North Korean diplomacy at this time, because their dependence on China has only increased. In the context of rising Sino-U.S. tension, it really boxes North Korea in and makes them even more dependent on China. And I think that it's important to remember that in the past, on this anniversary, the North Koreans have not always demonstrated recognition. And so the fact that Kim Jong-un is doing that at this time, I think underscores his recognition of North Korea's dependency on China.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Cheng, what is your assessment on the status of the North Korea-China relationship?
And I just also note that with COVID-19, both China and North Korea have taken steps that would actually have diluted their relationship somewhat. North Korea limited Chinese access for fear of spread of COVID, and the Chinese also have increased their border patrols with the North Koreans due to reports about banditry and looting of farms. So all is not well in the Pyongyang-Beijing relationship. So I agree absolutely with Dr. Snyder that this, I think, was an attempt to sort of smooth the waters at least a little bit.
Mm-hmm. After the U.S. election, will the U.S. and China be able to cooperate again on the North Korean issue? How will the U.S.-China relationship affect the circumstances surrounding the Korean Peninsula? Mr. Cheng first.
Frankly, I don't think China has been very helpful with regards to North Korea, certainly with regards to denuclearization at all, dating back over 2 decades. The Chinese impose sanctions only after they're diluted and then stop enforcing them after about a year. COVID has probably done more to actually limit Chinese trade with North Korea than all the UN sanctions combined. So fundamentally, China and the US see North Korea and the Korean Peninsula very differently. I don't think it matters who will be president. I don't see China cooperating really with the United States.
And Mr. Snyder, your thought?
Well, that's a grim prognosis, and I wish I could disagree. But I think that the fact of the matter is that the challenge is whether or not China and the United States can find a way to compartmentalize North Korea from the overall tone and tenor of increasing competition. And it has already been difficult over the course of the past 10 years to do that. I'm afraid that going forward, it may be even more so.
Now, the US presidential election is a little bit more than 1 week away, and the whole world is keeping a close eye on the outcome of the presidential race itself and its potential impact on US foreign policies, including those towards North Korea and China. Mr. Cheng and Mr. Snyder, thank you both very much. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.